My brother's wife claimed my baby at the hospital while I was unconscious. I woke up from my emergency C-section to find my room empty. No baby, no bassinet, no congratulations cards. Just my husband Mark, looking devastated. Where's our daughter? My voice was hoarse from the breathing tube. Mark couldn't meet my eyes. Your brother's wife. Rachel. Where is my baby? She's in the nursery. With Rachel and Tom. They're claiming she's theirs. I thought the drugs were making me hallucinate. What? Here's what happened while I was unconscious. Rachel had been admitted to the same hospital in labor 2 hours after my emergency surgery. She'd been faking a pregnancy for 9 months, complete with prosthetic belly, forged ultrasounds, and a fabricated due date matching mine. When our daughter was born, the nurses took her to the NICU for observation, standard after traumatic delivery. Rachel intercepted them in the hallway, hysterical, claiming there'd been a mix-up with the babies. She had paperwork, medical records showing she'd been my doctor, ultrasounds with her name, even a birth plan. My brother Tom backed her completely. They convinced the confused night staff that I was the one who'd been faking my pregnancy, that I was mentally unstable and trying to steal their baby. By the time Mark arrived from parking the car, Rachel was holding our daughter, had changed her into clothes she'd brought, and was breastfeeding her with some kind of supplemental nursing system that made it look real. She can't just take our baby. I tried to get up, but pain shot through my incision. Hospital security is involved. They're reviewing the footage, but Rachel somehow has documentation. Birth certificate applications, insurance cards, everything with their names. I was wheeling myself to the nursery before Mark could stop me. Through the window, I saw Rachel holding my daughter while Tom spoke to hospital administrators. Rachel looked up, made eye contact with me, and smiled. That's when I remembered her words from 6 months ago. Must be nice being the family favorite, getting pregnant so easily while others struggle. Rachel had 3 miscarriages in 5 years. Each one destroyed her more. The last one, 4 months before I got pregnant, nearly ended their marriage. She'd begged me not to tell anyone I was expecting, saying it was too painful. I burst through the nursery doors. That's my baby! Rachel clutched my daughter tighter. Security! She's trying to take our baby. DNA test! I screamed. Do a DNA test right now! The administrator, Mrs. Klein, looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Peterson? My name is Jennifer Mitchell. That's Rachel Peterson, my sister-in-law. Rachel started crying. She's confused. The anesthesia. She's been copying my pregnancy this whole time. Ask anyone. Check the surgical records, Mark shouted. My wife just had a C-section. Tom stepped forward. So did Rachel. Show them your scar, honey. Rachel lifted her gown. A fresh surgical incision crossed her abdomen. I felt the room spin. That's not... How? She did it to herself, Rachel said quietly, like she was concerned for me. She's sick. She cut herself to make it look real. We've been trying to get her help. Check the cameras, I screamed. Mrs. Klein pulled up footage on her tablet. It showed Rachel entering the hospital, clearly pregnant, being wheeled to delivery. But something was off about the timestamp. This is from yesterday, Mark noticed. But Rachel only arrived today. Mrs. Klein frowned, checking the metadata. The file's been corrupted. Several hours of footage are either missing or showing the wrong dates. That's when Dr. Rodriguez walked in, my OB-GYN who'd performed my C-section. Thank God, I breathed. Dr. Rodriguez, tell them. I'm sorry, who are you? She looked at me blankly. My blood went cold. I'm your patient. You just delivered my baby. 3 hours ago. She shook her head. I delivered Mrs. B. Peterson's baby. Rachel Peterson. I've never seen you before. Mark grabbed her arm. That's impossible. You were just in surgery with my wife. Dr. Rodriguez pulled out her phone, showed her surgical schedule. My name wasn't on it. Rachel's was. Someone's paid her off, Mark said. Or threatened her. Check the surgical records. But when they pulled the records, everything had Rachel's name. The anesthesiologist's notes, the nursing documentation, even the baby's footprints were filed under Baby Girl Peterson. I was sobbing now. Please, please, she's my baby. I carried her for 9 months. Please. Rachel stood up, still holding my daughter. We should go. This is too stressful for the baby. As they walked past, Rachel whispered something only I could hear. You announced your pregnancy at my miscarriage support group. In front of everyone. You humiliated me. I grabbed her arm. Rachel, please. Security. 2 guards pulled me back. Rachel walked out with my baby while I screamed. Mark was on the phone with our lawyer, but it was Sunday night. No judge would see us until morning. Meanwhile, Rachel and Tom were leaving with our daughter. That's when my phone buzzed. An unknown number had sent a video. It was Rachel, filmed months ago, talking to someone off camera. I've been planning this for months. Fake pregnancy, matching her due date, hacking the hospital system. Tom doesn't know. He thinks I'm really pregnant. By the time anyone figures it out, we'll be gone. The person behind the camera spoke. What about your brother-in-law? Won't he fight? Not from prison, he won't. Prison? Rachel smiled. Check Mark Mitchell's trunk tomorrow morning. The police will find something very interesting. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and held it out to Mark. My fingers wouldn't stop trembling, so he had to steady the phone himself, his warm hands wrapping around mine as we watched the screen together. Rachel's voice came through the speaker, clear and calm, talking to someone off camera about her plan. She explained the fake pregnancy, the matching due date, the hospital system hack, all of it laid out like she was discussing grocery shopping. Mark's face went completely white as he listened, his jaw clenching tighter with each word. When Rachel on the video mentioned framing him for something that would put him in prison, he actually stumbled backward and sat down hard on the edge of my hospital bed. I could feel his whole body shaking next to mine. He watched the rest of the video in silence, his breathing getting faster and shallower, and when it ended, he just sat there staring at the blank screen for a full minute before he could speak. Mark pulled out his own phone and scrolled through his contacts with fingers that kept missing the right buttons. He found Frederick Baldwin's number and hit call, putting it on speaker so I could hear. Frederick answered on the third ring, his voice groggy with sleep. Mark explained what happened in short, choppy sentences that kept breaking apart, and I could hear Frederick waking up fully on the other end of the line. Frederick asked us to wait while he got to his computer, and we heard rustling and footsteps, and then the click of a keyboard. Mark sent him the video file while we waited, and the silence on the phone felt like it lasted forever. When Frederick came back on the line, his voice had changed completely, all the sleepiness gone and replaced with sharp focus. He told us to forward the video to the police immediately, right that second, and under no circumstances should Mark go near his car or let anyone else touch it either. Frederick said he'd video conference with us within the hour and to not talk to anyone else until he got there. I forwarded the video to the local police department's tip line while Mark paced back and forth in my small hospital room. He kept running his hands through his hair and muttering under his breath, words I couldn't quite make out. A nurse came in to check my vitals and gave us both concerned looks but didn't ask questions. My blood pressure was high and my heart rate was racing, and the nurse adjusted something on my IV before leaving us alone again. Mark's phone rang exactly 43 minutes later, and Frederick's face appeared on the screen, his expression serious and focused. We explained everything from the beginning, starting with waking up to find our baby gone and ending with the video from the unknown number. Frederick listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad we could see in the corner of the screen. When we finished, he asked to see the video again, and we played it for him twice more while he watched with narrowed eyes. Frederick told us he was calling the police directly, that a tip line wasn't enough for something this serious. He hung up with us, and we waited in silence, both of us too scared to say out loud what we were thinking about what might be in Mark's car. 20 minutes later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice introduced herself as Detective Lucille Haley and said she was on her way to the hospital. She asked us not to discuss the case with anyone else and to stay exactly where we were. Mark and I sat together on my hospital bed, his arm around my shoulders, and watched the clock on the wall tick forward. At exactly 11 p.m., there was a knock on my door and Detective Haley walked in. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything about the room in one quick glance. She had dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and wore plain clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt with a badge clipped to her belt. Detective Haley pulled a chair close to my bed and sat down, her posture relaxed but her eyes alert. She asked us to tell her everything, and this time we didn't leave anything out. We told her about Rachel's 3 miscarriages, about my pregnancy announcement at the support group, about Rachel asking me to keep my pregnancy secret. We explained the fake documents, the intercepted baby, the falsified medical records, Dr. Rodriguez claiming not to know me. Detective Haley took notes in a small notebook, her pen moving quickly across the page. When we got to the part about the video, she asked to see it. Mark pulled it up on his phone and handed it to her. She watched it once all the way through without any change in expression, then watched it 2 more times, pausing occasionally to study Rachel's face or rewind certain sections. When she finished the 3rd viewing, she looked up at us and said the video was good evidence, but they needed to verify what Rachel had planted in Mark's car before anyone could tamper with it. Detective Haley made a phone call right there in my hospital room, requesting a forensics team to meet her in the hospital parking garage. She asked Mark for his car keys and the location of his vehicle. Mark's hands shook as he pulled the keys from his pocket and described where he'd parked on level 3. Detective Haley told us to stay in the room and that she'd be back as soon as they'd processed the vehicle. She left and Mark and I were alone again with nothing to do but wait. I kept thinking about our daughter upstairs with Rachel, wondering if she was hungry or cold or scared. Mark seemed to read my mind because he squeezed my hand and said our baby was too young to be scared, that she didn't understand what was happening. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't stop picturing Rachel holding her, touching her, pretending to be her mother. An hour and 40 minutes later, Detective Haley came back into my room. Her expression was grim, and she closed the door firmly behind her before speaking. The forensics team had found a kilo of cocaine hidden in a false bottom compartment in Mark's trunk, professionally packaged in vacuum-sealed plastic. The compartment was sophisticated, not something you'd notice in a casual search, but the drug dogs had found it immediately. Detective Haley explained that the amount and packaging would have triggered major trafficking charges, the kind that carried 10 to 15-year minimum sentences. She said Rachel's plan had been carefully thought out, designed to remove Mark completely from the picture and leave me vulnerable and alone. The drugs were being photographed and documented now, everything processed as evidence. Detective Haley said the forensics team was also checking the compartment for fingerprints, though she suspected Rachel had been smart enough to wear gloves. A different nurse came to check on me and said they were moving me to a private room on a different floor. Detective Haley arranged for a security guard to be posted outside my new room, explaining that we needed to take precautions until Rachel was in custody. 2 orderlies came with a wheelchair and helped me into it, careful of my incision. Mark gathered our things and followed as they wheeled me through the hallways to an elevator. The new room was bigger and quieter, away from the main maternity ward. The security guard, a large man with kind eyes, positioned himself in a chair right outside my door. Detective Haley came into the new room with us and explained her next steps. She was going to pull all the hospital security footage, looking for evidence of how Rachel had accessed the system and falsified the records. She said the video confession was strong evidence, but they needed to build a complete case showing exactly how Rachel had pulled off each part of her plan. Mark helped me into the new hospital bed and adjusted the pillows behind my back. My incision was throbbing, and the nurse brought me pain medication that made my head feel fuzzy. Detective Haley left around 1 a.m., promising to update us as soon as she had more information. Mark pulled a chair close to my bed and held my hand. Neither of us could sleep. We just sat there in the dark room, thinking about our daughter just floors above us in Rachel's arms. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rachel's face through that nursery window. Her smile when she'd made eye contact with me, that look of triumph like she'd already won. Mark kept checking his phone even though there was nothing to check, just refreshing the screen over and over like something might change. Around 3 a.m., a nurse came in to check my vitals again and brought Mark a blanket, but he didn't use it. We both just stayed awake, watching the clock and waiting for morning. At 6 a.m. exactly, there was a soft knock on my door and Detective Haley came back in. She looked tired but alert, like she'd been up all night too. She pulled the chair close to my bed again, and her expression made my stomach drop even before she started speaking. The investigation had uncovered something that made my blood run cold. Rachel hadn't worked alone on this. She'd had help from someone inside the hospital's IT department, someone who'd given her access to the medical records system weeks ago. This person had created login credentials for Rachel and shown her how to navigate the system, how to insert false documentation gradually so it wouldn't trigger any security alerts. Detective Haley said they were working on identifying the IT employee now, pulling access logs and tracking who'd created the fake credentials. The sophistication of the hack suggested someone with real technical knowledge, not just basic computer skills. Before I could fully process that information, there was another knock on my door. Josephine Santos walked in, the hospital administrator I'd seen briefly the night before. She looked exhausted and furious, her professional composure barely holding together. She apologized to us first thing, her voice tight with controlled anger. The hospital was conducting a full internal investigation into the security breach. She was personally reviewing every single piece of documentation that had Rachel's name on it, and she'd already found problems. Timestamps didn't match up between different documents. Digital signatures showed inconsistencies that suggested forgery. Some files had metadata indicating they'd been created or modified from IP addresses that shouldn't have had access to those systems. Josephine said the IT department was cooperating fully with the police investigation, and they'd already identified 3 employees who'd had the access level needed to create the kind of backdoor Rachel had used. The court-appointed medical team arrived around 9 a.m., 3 people in medical scrubs carrying equipment bags and clipboards. The nurse practitioner introduced herself as Sandra and explained they needed to document my surgical incision and collect DNA samples for the emergency custody proceedings. I pulled up my hospital gown while Mark stood beside the bed holding my hand. Sandra photographed the incision from multiple angles, her camera clicking steadily as she documented the fresh surgical site. She measured the incision length with a small ruler, noted the suture pattern, checked for signs of infection or complications. The whole examination took maybe 15 minutes, but felt longer because I knew these photos would be evidence in court, proof that I'd actually given birth while Rachel's incision was somehow fake. Sandra dictated notes into a small recording device, describing the incision as consistent with a recent cesarean delivery performed within the last 30 hours. She swabbed the inside of my cheek for DNA, sealed the sample in a plastic tube, and had both Mark and me sign paperwork confirming the collection process. Before leaving, Sandra told us the medical team would submit their findings directly to the judge handling our emergency petition, and that her report would clearly state my surgical recovery was real and recent. Tom showed up at my door about 20 minutes after the medical team left. He looked terrible, like he'd been awake all night, his hair messy and his eyes red. He stood in the doorway without coming in, his hands shoved in his jacket pockets. He said Rachel was still insisting the DNA test would prove the baby was hers, that she kept saying I was the one who'd faked everything. But Tom's voice wavered when he said it, like he was starting to doubt. He told me he'd noticed Rachel's incision looked weird this morning, that it seemed to be healing way too fast for surgery that supposedly happened 2 days ago. The edges looked almost sealed already, not red and fresh like mine. He asked if he could see my incision to compare, and I showed him without saying anything. Tom stared at the clear difference between my fresh surgical wound and whatever Rachel had done to herself. His face went pale and he backed up against the door frame like his legs might give out. I wanted to scream at him right there. I wanted to ask how he could have believed Rachel's story even for a second, how he didn't question his wife suddenly being pregnant with a due date that perfectly matched mine. But looking at Tom's face, seeing him actually break down in real time, I realized he was another one of Rachel's victims. He'd been lied to just like everyone else, manipulated into thinking his wife was carrying their baby when she was really planning to steal mine. Tom asked me in this cracked voice if I really thought Rachel could do something this extreme, if his wife was actually capable of this level of deception. I told him about the comment Rachel made at her miscarriage support group 6 months ago, how she'd said it must be nice being the family favorite and getting pregnant so easily. Tom's face changed when I said that, recognition dawning like he was remembering other comments Rachel had made, other small signs he'd ignored. He told me Rachel had been obsessed with my pregnancy from the start, asking constant questions about my due date and my doctor and every detail of my prenatal care. He'd thought she was just being supportive, trying to stay involved despite her own pain, but now he was seeing it all differently. Detective Haley spent most of the morning interviewing the night nurse who'd been on duty when Rachel intercepted our baby. Mark and I weren't there for the interview, but Haley came to our room afterward to tell us what she'd learned. The nurse had broken down crying during questioning, explaining that Rachel's paperwork looked completely legitimate when she showed up claiming there'd been a mix-up. The documents had the right hospital logos, the right format, even the right reference numbers that matched the hospital's filing system. The nurse had no reason to doubt someone who knew specific details about the delivery, details that only someone with access to the medical records would know. Rachel had known the exact time of birth, the baby's weight and length, even the name of the anesthesiologist who'd been in the operating room. The nurse said she'd been confused when I showed up afterward claiming to be the mother, because Rachel's story was so detailed and her documentation looked so real. Detective Haley explained that this level of planning showed premeditation, that Rachel had spent months preparing for this moment, studying the hospital's systems and creating perfect forgeries. Milo Navarro from the hospital IT security came by around noon with his laptop to show us what he'd found. He'd been analyzing the system breach all morning, tracing digital fingerprints through the medical records database. Milo explained that Rachel's accomplice had created a backdoor into the system 3 months ago, a hidden access point that bypassed all the normal security protocols. The accomplice was a contractor named Derek who'd worked in the hospital's IT department until 2 weeks ago, right before my due date. Derek had disappeared after his last day of work, probably paid off by Rachel to vanish once the plan was in motion. Milo showed us server logs proving Derek had accessed my medical records dozens of times over the past 3 months, copying information and creating fake documentation with Rachel's name inserted where mine should have been. The sophistication of the hack suggested Derek had real technical skills, not just basic computer knowledge. He'd covered his tracks carefully, but Milo had found fragments of deleted files and backup records that proved the tampering. Detective Haley was already working with federal authorities to track Derek down, since he'd crossed state lines and the computer crimes fell under FBI jurisdiction. Frederick called from his office with an update about the bank records. He'd filed motions to freeze Rachel and Tom's accounts that morning, looking for evidence of payments related to the fake pregnancy scheme. The bank had cooperated quickly, probably scared of liability for not catching suspicious activity earlier. Frederick said the records showed a $15,000 withdrawal from Rachel and Tom's savings account 2 weeks ago, the same week Derek disappeared from his IT job. The withdrawal was in cash, no paper trail beyond the bank transaction itself, which suggested Rachel had paid Derek in untraceable bills. Frederick was filing additional motions to get Rachel's credit card statements and phone records, building a complete financial picture of how she'd funded the entire operation. He told me the evidence was piling up, so fast that Rachel's lawyer would have a hard time defending her once we got to court. I was discharged from the hospital after 36 hours of observation. My body still hurt from the surgery, every movement pulling at the incision, but I couldn't stay there anymore knowing my daughter was somewhere else with Rachel. Mark helped me get dressed in the clothes he'd brought from home, moving slowly because bending was painful. We packed up the few things we'd accumulated during the hospital stay and checked out through the main entrance instead of the maternity ward because I couldn't handle walking past the nursery again. Mark drove us to a hotel near the courthouse, a decent place with a kitchenette and a comfortable bed. I couldn't face going home to our house, to the nursery we'd spent months preparing with the crib and changing table and all the baby clothes hanging in the closet. Our daughter should have been coming home with us, starting her life in the room we'd made for her. But instead, she was with Rachel, and we were hiding in a hotel room waiting for the legal system to fix what had been stolen. The DNA results came back 41 hours after the samples were collected, 7 hours faster than the 48-hour estimate we'd been given. Frederick called us at the hotel with the news, his voice tight with controlled excitement. The results were exactly what we knew they would be, but seeing it confirmed in official laboratory documentation felt huge. I was the biological mother, Mark was the biological father, and Rachel had zero genetic connection to our daughter. Frederick said he was filing for emergency custody immediately, attaching the DNA results and the medical team's documentation of my fresh C-section incision. He told us to stay near our phones because the judge might want to see us in court within hours, that this kind of evidence usually moved cases very quickly through the system. Rachel's lawyer tried to claim the DNA test results were contaminated or falsified somehow. Frederick called us with this update, sounding almost amused by how desperate the argument was. The court-appointed medical team's documentation made it impossible to argue the test was wrong, because they'd photographed my incision and verified it was consistent with recent delivery. Rachel's lawyer was grasping at anything to delay the inevitable, but the judge wasn't having it. The judge ordered Rachel to surrender our daughter immediately to Child Protective Services, pending a full custody hearing scheduled for 3 days from now. Frederick said the judge had been harsh in her ruling, clearly angry about the deception and the hospital system breach. Rachel had until 6 p.m. that evening to comply with the court order, or she'd be held in contempt and possibly arrested. Rachel didn't comply. 6 p.m. came and went with no word from her or her lawyer. By 7 p.m., police had surrounded the house Rachel shared with Tom, trying to negotiate with her to come out peacefully with our daughter. Tom had called me from outside his own house, where police had cordoned him off for his safety and told me Rachel had barricaded herself inside. She'd locked all the doors and windows, pulled the curtains closed, and refused to answer her phone. Mark and I watched it unfold on the news from our hotel room, local stations covering the standoff with helicopter footage showing police cars surrounding the suburban house. The news anchors were calling it a custody dispute turned standoff, showing old photos of Rachel and Tom from their social media accounts. I sat on the hotel bed staring at the TV screen, feeling like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare where nothing made sense anymore. My daughter was inside that house with a woman who'd proven she was capable of anything, and all I could do was watch it happen on television while police negotiators tried to talk Rachel into surrendering. My phone rang. Tom's name flashed on the screen. I grabbed it so fast I nearly dropped it. His voice came through broken and raw, like he'd been crying for hours. Police had him standing outside his own house behind yellow tape. Rachel had locked herself inside with our daughter. He kept saying he was sorry, the words tumbling over each other. He'd found something in their attic that morning. A fake pregnancy belly, the kind used in movies. It was hidden in a box under old Christmas decorations. Next to it was a journal filled with Rachel's handwriting. 9 months of planning. Every detail written down. How she'd match my due date. How she'd hack the hospital systems. How she'd convince everyone I was the crazy one. Tom's voice cracked when he told me he'd believed her completely. She'd worn that belly around the house. She'd talked about baby names. She'd made him feel the fake kicks. His whole marriage was built on lies and he hadn't seen it. I wanted to feel sorry for him, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not while Rachel still had our baby. Mark and I sat frozen in that hotel room watching the news coverage. Helicopter cameras showed Tom's house from above. Police cars surrounded it. Officers crouched behind their vehicles. A negotiator stood near the front door with a phone pressed to his ear. The news anchor kept using words like standoff and barricaded. They showed old photos of Rachel from her social media. In every picture, she looked normal, happy, not like someone who would steal a baby. The clock on the news broadcast showed it had been 2 hours since police arrived, then 3 hours, then 4. My body ached from the surgery, but I couldn't sit still. I paced the hotel room until Mark made me stop because I was pulling my incision. Every time my phone buzzed, I grabbed it hoping for news. Detective Haley sent updates every 30 minutes. Rachel wasn't answering her phone. She'd covered all the windows with blankets. They couldn't see inside. They didn't know if our daughter was okay. 6 hours passed. The sun was setting when movement happened on the TV screen. The front door opened slowly. Rachel stepped onto the porch holding our daughter wrapped in a pink blanket. Police officers moved forward carefully with their hands up showing they weren't armed. Rachel stood there for a long moment just looking at them. Then she walked down the porch steps. An officer took our baby from her arms while 2 others guided Rachel to a police car. Paramedics rushed forward to check the baby. I watched them unwrap the blanket and examine her tiny body. My knees gave out. The room tilted sideways. Mark caught me before I hit the carpet. He held me while I sobbed into his chest. Our daughter was safe. She was out of that house. She was away from Rachel. A social worker arrived at our hotel room 3 hours later. She carried our daughter in a car seat, the baby sleeping peacefully like nothing had happened. The social worker's name was Mrs. Chen, and she explained the rules before letting me hold my own child. Supervised visits only until the custody hearing. Standard procedure in contested cases. I barely heard her. I was staring at my daughter's face. 48 hours old, and I'd missed everything. Her first 2 days of life stolen by Rachel. Mrs. Chen placed her in my arms and I started crying again. She was so small, so perfect. Her fingers curled around mine. I tried to memorize every detail of her face because I didn't know when they'd make me give her back. Mark sat next to me with his arm around my shoulders. We were finally holding our baby, but we couldn't keep her. Not yet. Mrs. Chen explained the custody hearing was scheduled for 3 days from now. Until then, we'd have supervised visits at the hotel, 4 hours each day. A social worker would be present the entire time. Frederick had already told us not to argue. Cooperate with everything. Show them we were stable and capable. Our daughter started fussing, and I knew she needed to eat. I tried to breastfeed her, but she didn't latch right. She kept turning her head away and crying. Mrs. Chen called a lactation consultant who arrived 20 minutes later. The consultant was patient and kind. She explained that Rachel had been using a supplemental nursing system that confused the baby. We had to retrain her to breastfeed naturally. It took almost an hour before my daughter finally latched correctly. The relief I felt was huge. This was something Rachel couldn't fake. This was real. Detective Haley called while we were still with the baby. Rachel had been arrested at the scene. The charges were serious. Kidnapping, conspiracy, fraud, computer crimes for the hospital system breach, drug charges for the cocaine planted in Mark's trunk. Her bail hearing was scheduled for the next morning. The prosecutor was asking for $500,000. Tom had already told police he wouldn't pay it. Rachel would stay in county jail until trial. Frederick sent a text saying this was good news. It meant Rachel couldn't run. She couldn't disappear with forged documents and a new identity. She was locked up where she couldn't hurt anyone. Detective Haley had more news the next day. They'd tracked down Derek, the IT contractor who helped Rachel hack the hospital systems. He was in another state trying to board an international flight. Airport security found $50,000 in cash in his carry-on bag. Derek was arrested and brought back to face charges. Within hours, he was talking to prosecutors. He gave them everything. Detailed testimony about how Rachel had paid him, screenshots of their conversations, bank records showing the money transfers. He was cooperating fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. Frederick said Derek's testimony would seal the case. There was no way Rachel could claim innocence now. The next 3 days were strange and painful. Mrs. Chen brought our daughter to the hotel twice a day for supervised visits. 4 hours in the morning, 4 hours in the evening. Mark and I learned how to be parents under the watchful eyes of social workers. We figured out feeding schedules. We practiced diaper changes. We learned which cry meant hungry and which meant tired. It should have been private. It should have been just us in our own home. Instead, we had strangers taking notes on clipboards while we bonded with our baby. But I didn't complain. Frederick kept reminding us to cooperate, to show them we were good parents, to prove we deserved custody. So I smiled at the social workers and answered their questions and pretended everything was normal, even though nothing about this was normal. The custody hearing arrived on a cold morning. The courthouse was packed when we walked in. My parents sat in the front row behind our table. They'd driven through the night to be there. Tom sat alone on the other side of the courtroom. He looked terrible. His face was pale and he'd lost weight. He wouldn't look at me when I walked past. Hospital staff filled several rows. Josephine Santos was there, the night nurse who'd been on duty. Even Dr. Rodriguez showed up looking uncomfortable. News cameras lined the hallway outside because reporters had caught wind of the case. Frederick had warned us about the media attention. A baby kidnapping by a family member made for good headlines. Frederick stood up when the judge called our case. He was calm and organized as he presented our evidence. He started with the DNA test results showing I was the biological mother. Then he played Rachel's video confession where she admitted planning everything for months. Derek's testimony came next with detailed explanations of how he'd hacked the hospital systems. The planted drugs were entered as evidence along with photos of Mark's car trunk. Rachel's fake pregnancy documentation was spread across a table for the judge to examine. The hospital's internal investigation findings showed all the security breaches Rachel had exploited. Frederick spoke for 40 minutes laying out every piece of evidence. Rachel's lawyer barely responded. He focused on her mental health history instead. Her 3 miscarriages, her depression, her therapy records. He was trying to make her seem sick instead of criminal. The judge didn't look convinced. I had to testify next. Frederick asked me about the miscarriage support group where I'd announced my pregnancy. I explained how Rachel had reacted, how she'd asked me to keep it secret because seeing pregnant women hurt too much. I realized while talking that I'd missed so many warning signs. Rachel had asked specific questions about my due date. She'd wanted to know my doctor's name. She'd asked about my hospital preferences. I thought she was just being interested, just trying to be supportive despite her own pain. I didn't see she was gathering information to build her fake pregnancy story. I felt stupid admitting this out loud. Frederick kept his questions simple and clear. He made me explain exactly what Rachel had whispered to me in the nursery about announcing my pregnancy at her support group, about being the family favorite. The judge wrote notes while I spoke. Her expression was hard to read, but she kept her eyes on me the entire time. Witness stand was hard to sit in. Mark squeezed my hand when the judge asked about Rachel's state of mind during the planning phase. Frederick stood and presented the mental health evaluation that had arrived 2 days earlier. The psychologist had spent 6 hours with Rachel over 3 sessions. The report described severe depression that started after her first miscarriage and got worse with each loss. Rachel had developed what the doctor called complicated grief that twisted into something dangerous. She'd convinced herself that I didn't deserve to be a mother because I got pregnant easily while she suffered. The evaluation showed Rachel believed taking my baby would fix everything wrong in her life. Her lawyer jumped on this immediately and argued that Rachel needed psychiatric care in a hospital instead of prison. He talked about how grief can break a person's mind and make them do terrible things they wouldn't normally consider. The prosecutor wasn't buying it. She pointed out that Rachel had planned everything for 9 months with careful detail. Rachel had researched hospital security systems and found someone to hack the records. She'd ordered a prosthetic belly online and practiced wearing it for months. She'd created fake ultrasound images using photo editing software. She'd timed her fake due date to match mine exactly. She'd even cut herself to create a surgical scar that would look recent. Those weren't the actions of someone too mentally ill to understand right from wrong. Those were the calculated steps of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and worked hard to get away with it. The judge listened to both sides and said she'd issue her ruling within a week. 3 months passed between that hearing and the day Rachel's plea deal came through. Frederick called me at home while I was feeding our daughter her afternoon bottle. Rachel had accepted 12 years in prison followed by mandatory psychiatric treatment. When she got out, she'd have permanent restraining orders keeping her at least 500 feet away from our family forever. I sat there holding my baby and trying to figure out how I felt about 12 years. Part of me wanted Rachel locked up for life. She'd stolen my daughter and tried to destroy my husband's future with those planted drugs. She'd corrupted hospital records and manipulated staff and lied to everyone, including her own husband. But another part of me felt sad that 12 years wasn't enough to fix what she'd broken inside herself. No amount of prison time would give Rachel back her lost babies or heal the grief that had twisted her into someone capable of kidnapping. I realized sitting there that no sentence would ever feel right. Too harsh and too light at the same time. Tom called me a week after Rachel went to prison. He'd sold the house where they'd lived together for 8 years. He was moving to Oregon for a job opportunity and a chance to start over somewhere nobody knew about his wife, the kidnapper. His voice sounded tired and older than his 34 years. He asked if he could send gifts for our daughter on her birthday and Christmas. He wanted to know if maybe someday when she was older she could know she had an uncle who cared about her, even though his wife had done something horrible. I told him yes to the gifts and yes to staying in touch. I was learning slowly that Tom had been fooled, just like the hospital staff. Rachel had shown him fake ultrasound photos and worn that prosthetic belly around the house for months. She'd researched pregnancy symptoms online and faked morning sickness and food cravings. Tom had believed he was going to be a father right up until the police arrested his wife for kidnapping. He was a victim too, just in a different way than me and Mark. Our daughter turned 4 months old on a Tuesday in late October. I was sitting in the pediatrician's office for her checkup when I realized we'd finally found something close to normal life. She was eating every 3 hours on a predictable schedule. She was sleeping 6-hour stretches at night. She smiled when Mark came home from work. She grabbed at toys hanging from her play gym. The doctor said she was hitting all her milestones right on track. Her weight and height were in the 50th percentile. Her reflexes looked good. Her eyes tracked movement properly. The doctor asked if I had concerns about her early trauma, and I explained about the first 48 hours. The doctor reviewed her chart and said babies that young don't form memories the way older children do. Our daughter showed no signs of attachment issues or developmental delays. She was healthy and happy and completely unaware that someone had tried to steal her life before it really started. The hospital's internal investigation wrapped up the same week our daughter turned 4 months old. Josephine Santos called to tell me they'd fired 3 administrators whose mistakes had allowed Rachel to execute her plan. One administrator had approved Derek's system access without proper background checks. Another had failed to update the security protocols that should have caught the falsified records. A third had ignored multiple red flags in the footage timestamps that might have exposed Rachel's scheme earlier. Josephine kept her job because she'd handled the crisis well once Rachel's video confession surfaced. She'd immediately locked down the maternity ward and preserved evidence and cooperated fully with the police investigation. She sent me detailed updates about the new security measures every few weeks. The hospital had installed biometric scanners for all maternity ward access. They'd hired additional IT security staff to monitor the medical record system in real time. They'd implemented new protocols requiring multiple staff members to verify any baby leaving the ward. Josephine seemed genuinely committed to making sure no other family went through what we had experienced. Mark and I talked about having another baby one night after we'd put our daughter down to sleep. We were sitting on the couch drinking tea and watching some mindless TV show when he brought it up. He said he wanted more children eventually, but not yet. We needed time to heal from everything that had happened. We needed time to enjoy our daughter without constantly looking over our shoulders waiting for the next crisis. Our therapist agreed when I mentioned it at my next session. She said trying for another baby too soon would feel like we were rushing to replace the stolen time instead of processing the trauma properly. She wanted us to wait until we felt emotionally ready instead of letting fear or anger drive our family planning decisions. I went back to work part-time when our daughter was 5 months old. My boss had been incredibly understanding through the whole kidnapping ordeal and the court proceedings that followed. She'd told me to take whatever time I needed, and my job would be waiting. I started with 3 days a week working from home while our daughter napped or played in her bouncer next to my desk. Having the structure of work helped me feel like myself again. I'd spent 5 months focused entirely on being a mother and fighting to keep my baby. Getting back to projects and deadlines and normal workplace problems felt almost relaxing compared to everything else I'd been dealing with. Rachel's letter arrived on a cold morning in early December. Frederick called to say her lawyer had forwarded it to his office per the restraining order requirements. Rachel wasn't allowed to contact us directly, so any communication had to go through our attorney first. I talked to my therapist about whether I should read it. She said it was my choice, but I should prepare myself for Rachel to not take full responsibility. People who commit crimes like kidnapping often struggle to see past their own pain to understand the harm they caused others. I decided to read the letter sitting in Frederick's office with Mark next to me. Rachel's handwriting was messy and slanted. The letter rambled for 3 pages about her miscarriages and her depression and how much she'd wanted to be a mother. She talked about seeing me pregnant and feeling like the universe was cruel and unfair. She mentioned the support group where I'd announced my pregnancy and how betrayed she'd felt that day. But she never quite said the words, "I'm sorry for what I did to you." She never acknowledged that she'd stolen my daughter's first 2 days of life or tried to send my husband to prison. The letter was all about Rachel's pain, with barely any recognition of mine. I folded it back up and told Frederick to file it away. I realized Rachel might never truly understand what she'd done to us. Detective Haley stopped by our house on a Saturday afternoon when our daughter was 6 months old. She wanted to officially close the case and meet the baby she'd helped recover. Our daughter was sitting in her high chair, grinning at everyone and grabbing at the toys on her tray. Haley held her for a few minutes, and our daughter smiled and drooled on the detective's shoulder. Haley told us she was using our case in training seminars about hospital security and parental abduction. She'd presented at 3 conferences already, with more scheduled for next year. She wanted other hospitals and law enforcement agencies to learn from the security failures that had allowed Rachel's scheme to succeed. Our nightmare was becoming a teaching tool that might prevent future kidnappings. That felt like something good coming from something terrible. Christmas morning arrived with snow covering our front yard and our daughter wearing the ridiculous elf outfit my mom had bought. She was 6.5 months old and could sit up on her own now. She grabbed at the wrapping paper on her presents and tried to eat the bows. Mark took about 100 photos while I made coffee and tried not to cry. This was our daughter's first Christmas, and it should have been pure joy. But I kept thinking about how Rachel had tried to steal all of this from us. She'd wanted these firsts and these milestones for herself. She'd planned to raise our daughter as her own and watch her grow up and celebrate holidays like this one. But she'd failed. Our daughter was here with us wearing her silly elf costume and drooling on her new toys. Mark wrapped his arm around my shoulders and I leaned into him. We decided months ago to focus on the present instead of dwelling on what Rachel had tried to take. Our daughter was safe and healthy and ours. That was what mattered. Tom showed up on Christmas Eve with a rental car and a nervous smile, carrying wrapped presents and a bottle of wine. I opened the door, and we stood there looking at each other for a long moment before I stepped back to let him in. Mark came down the stairs with our daughter in his arms, and Tom's face crumpled when he saw her. She was 7 months old now, wearing a red velvet dress my mom had bought, and she stared at Tom with curious eyes. He set down the presents and held out his arms, asking if he could hold her, and I nodded. Tom took her carefully, supporting her head like she might break, and tears ran down his face while he told her he was sorry. Our daughter grabbed his nose and smiled, completely unaware of everything that had happened, and Tom laughed through his tears. He apologized to me and Mark again, explaining that he'd been in therapy twice a week trying to understand how he missed all the signs. I told him we were working on forgiveness because staying angry was eating us alive, and it wouldn't change what Rachel had done. We had dinner together, and it was awkward but healing, and when Tom left that night, he hugged me tight and whispered that he'd spend the rest of his life making this right. The hospital sent us an invitation in January to attend the launch event for their new security system. Josephine Santos had been sending us updates for months about the changes they were implementing, and now everything was finally ready. Mark and I walked into the conference room where they'd set up displays showing the biometric scanners, the real-time monitoring systems, and the enhanced baby identification protocols. Josephine gave a presentation to the hospital board members and local media, explaining how our case had exposed critical security gaps that could have allowed other kidnappings. She publicly credited us with driving the improvements, thanking us for our cooperation during the investigation and our willingness to share our story. Several reporters asked us questions afterward, and I explained that while I wished none of this had been necessary, I was glad something good was coming from our nightmare. The new system required fingerprint scans for anyone accessing medical records, real-time alerts when records were modified, and electronic tags on all newborns that would trigger alarms if they left the maternity ward. Mark squeezed my hand while we toured the upgraded nursery, both of us thinking about how different things might have been if these protections had existed 7 months ago. 3 weeks later, I sat in a government building waiting to testify before a state legislative committee about hospital security regulations. My hands were shaking and my mouth was dry, and I kept reading over my prepared statement even though I'd memorized it days ago. Frederick had helped me write it, focusing on specific security failures and practical solutions rather than getting too emotional about what happened to us. A legislative aide called my name, and I walked into the hearing room where 12 lawmakers sat behind a long table, looking at me with expressions ranging from sympathetic to skeptical. I introduced myself and started reading my statement, describing how Rachel had accessed the hospital computer system, falsified medical records, and walked out with my daughter while staff had no way to verify who was telling the truth. My voice cracked when I talked about watching Rachel leave with my baby, but I kept going, explaining that better security protocols could prevent this from happening to other families. When I finished, several committee members asked questions about specific security measures and how much they would cost to implement. One lawmaker told me afterward that our case would definitely influence the legislation they were drafting, and another said she was a mother herself and couldn't imagine what we'd been through. Walking out of that building, I felt like the vulnerability had been worth it if it meant protecting other parents. Our daughter turned 1-year-old in late March, and we threw a party at our house with everyone who'd supported us through the crisis. My parents came early to help set up decorations, and Mark's sister brought a huge cake shaped like a teddy bear. Frederick showed up with his wife and kids, and Detective Haley arrived with a wrapped present and a card. I looked around the living room at all these people celebrating with us. People who'd answered phone calls at midnight, who'd sat through court hearings, who'd brought us food when we were too stressed to cook. Our daughter sat in her high chair smashing cake into her face while everyone laughed and took pictures, and I realized how much community we had. These people had fought alongside us to bring her home, and now they were here watching her blow out her first birthday candle. Mark put his arm around my waist and pulled me close, and I leaned my head on his shoulder while our daughter grinned at everyone with frosting all over her face. A letter came from the prosecutor's office in April informing us that Rachel's first parole hearing was scheduled for 7 years from now. I called the prosecutor immediately, anxiety flooding through me at the thought of Rachel getting out early, but he assured me it was standard procedure to schedule the hearing, even though she was unlikely to be released. He explained that given the severity of her crimes and how calculated the scheme had been, the parole board would almost certainly deny her request. We were welcome to testify at the hearing if we wanted to, and he recommended we do so, to make sure the board understood the lasting impact of Rachel's actions. I told Mark about it that night after our daughter was asleep, and we agreed we'd testify at every parole hearing if necessary. Rachel had stolen our daughter's first 2 days of life and tried to destroy our family, and we weren't going to let the parole board forget that, just because time had passed. Mark came home from work in May with news that made both of us cry with relief. He'd gotten a promotion with a significant raise, and the financial stability meant we could finally stop worrying about the future. The hospital settlement had helped, but we'd been careful with that money, putting most of it away for our daughter's college fund and using only what we needed for therapy and legal fees. Now with Mark's new salary, we could breathe easier, planning for our daughter's future in ways that felt hopeful instead of fearful. We opened a second college fund account that weekend and set up automatic deposits, building something positive for her future that Rachel couldn't touch or take away. A parenting magazine contacted me in June asking if I'd write an article about our experience for their security awareness issue. I spent 2 weeks working on it with Mark's input, focusing on practical advice about hospital security and trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. The article came out in August, and the response was overwhelming. Dozens of parents emailed me through the magazine with their own stories of close calls and security concerns, mothers who'd had nurses try to take their babies without proper identification, fathers who'd noticed strangers hanging around maternity wards. We started an email group to share information and advocate for better protections, creating a network of parents who understood that hospital security wasn't just about locked doors, but about verification protocols and staff training. The magazine asked me to write a follow-up article 3 months later, and suddenly I had this platform to push for changes that could protect families nationwide. Tom called in November of the following year to tell me he was getting remarried. His voice was nervous when he asked if he could bring his new wife to meet us and our daughter, and I said yes without hesitation. They drove up 2 weeks later, and Tom's wife Sarah turned out to be kind and understanding about the complicated family history. She worked as a teacher and had known Tom for 6 months before he told her about Rachel and what had happened. Sarah held our daughter carefully and told her she was beautiful, and she didn't ask intrusive questions or act like she needed to know every detail. I watched Tom with her and saw how different he was, how much lighter and happier, and I felt genuinely glad that he was rebuilding his life with someone healthy. We had dinner together and made plans for them to visit again at Christmas, and when they left, I told Mark that maybe Tom deserved a second chance at happiness after everything Rachel had put him through. Our daughter turned 2 years old and started talking in full sentences, calling us Mama and Dada and asking constant questions about everything she saw. Every milestone felt like a victory over Rachel's attempt to steal our family. She was a happy, confident toddler who ran everywhere instead of walking, who loved books and bubbles and playing in the backyard. She had no memory of those first 2 days, no awareness of the trauma that had surrounded her birth, and we were determined to keep it that way until she was old enough to understand. Mark and I had decided we'd tell her the truth eventually, probably when she was a teenager, but for now she just knew that Aunt Rachel had been sick and couldn't be around us anymore. She accepted this explanation easily the way kids do, more interested in her toys and her friends than in complicated adult problems. I got pregnant again that fall, and we were both excited and terrified. The pregnancy was carefully monitored with extra ultrasounds and appointments, and when it came time for delivery, we requested enhanced security measures at the hospital. The staff was incredibly accommodating, understanding our trauma without making us explain everything in detail. They assigned us a private room with a security guard posted outside, gave us special identification bracelets that matched the baby's ankle tag, and made sure the same nurses stayed with us through the entire delivery. I had a scheduled C-section this time, no emergency, and when our son was born, the doctor placed him directly on my chest before doing anything else. I held my baby immediately after birth with no interruptions or fear, crying with relief that this time everything was normal and safe. Mark stood beside me taking pictures while our son looked up at us with dark eyes, and I felt like we'd finally reclaimed what Rachel had tried to take from us. Our son was 6 months old when Frederick showed up at our door on Thanksgiving morning carrying a pie his wife had baked and a bottle of wine. He'd driven 3 hours to be with us for the holiday, and when I opened the door, he pulled me into a hug without saying anything. Mark set another place at the table, and we spent the afternoon eating too much turkey, while our daughter showed Frederick all her toys, and our son slept in his bouncer. After dinner, Frederick helped Mark clean up while I nursed the baby, and when we were all settled in the living room with coffee, he told us something that made me realize how far our case had reached. He'd changed his entire practice after representing us, focusing exclusively on parental rights and hospital liability cases now. 3 other families had come to him in the past year with situations similar to ours, cases where hospital security failures or document fraud had put their children at risk. He was using everything he learned from our case to help them navigate the legal system faster and more effectively than we'd been able to. He showed us photos on his phone of a couple in another state who'd just been reunited with their baby after someone tried to switch hospital bracelets during a shift change. Frederick had gotten them emergency custody in 18 hours instead of the 48 it took us, and he said it was because he knew exactly what evidence to gather and which arguments worked with judges. Watching him talk about his work with such passion made me realize that Rachel's crime had created something positive, that other families were being protected because of what we went through. Detective Haley called me on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring asking if I had time to meet for coffee. She'd retired from the police force 2 months earlier, and I hadn't heard from her since she came by to meet our son right after he was born. We met at a cafe near the courthouse, and she slid a thick manuscript across the table to me before she even ordered. It was her book about criminal psychology with a chapter dedicated to grief-driven crimes, and our case was featured prominently. She'd changed some identifying details, but anyone who knew our story would recognize it immediately. She wanted permission to use our real names in the final version because she believed other families needed to learn from what happened. I took the manuscript home and read it that night after the kids were in bed, and seeing our experience analyzed through the lens of Rachel's psychological breakdown was strange but also healing in a way. Detective Haley had interviewed Rachel extensively during the investigation, and she'd included excerpts that showed how Rachel's grief had twisted into delusion over months of careful planning. The chapter explained how miscarriage trauma can sometimes trigger obsessive behaviors, and how Rachel had convinced herself that taking our baby was somehow making things fair. I called Detective Haley the next morning and told her she could use our real names because if even one family recognized warning signs in someone, they knew it would be worth having our story out there publicly. Our daughter's first day of preschool arrived when she was 3.5, and I was more nervous than she was. I'd worried for months about how she'd do in social situations, whether the chaos of her first 48 hours had somehow affected her ability to attach and trust. Mark and I walked her into the bright classroom full of toys and tiny chairs, and she let go of my hand immediately, running toward a girl building with blocks. The teacher smiled at us and gently suggested we leave before our daughter even noticed we were gone. I stood outside the classroom door for 10 minutes watching through the window as she played and laughed with the other kids, showing no hesitation or fear. When we picked her up 3 hours later, she was covered in paint and talking nonstop about her new friend Emmy and the hamster in the cage by the window. Over the next few weeks, her teacher told us repeatedly how well-adjusted and confident our daughter was, how easily she made friends and resolved conflicts. Our therapist said children are remarkably resilient when they're raised in stable, loving environments, and watching our daughter thrive felt like the ultimate victory over Rachel's attempt to damage our family. She had no memory of being stolen, no awareness that her first days of life had been anything other than normal, and we'd managed to give her the secure childhood she deserved. The letter from Rachel arrived on a Thursday, and I recognized her handwriting on the envelope immediately. It was the fourth letter she'd sent from prison, but the first one I actually opened. The previous three had gone straight into the trash because I wasn't ready to hear anything she had to say, but my therapist had been encouraging me to consider reading one when I felt strong enough. This letter was different from what I expected, more coherent and genuinely apologetic than the rambling justifications I'd imagined. Rachel wrote about the intensive therapy she'd been doing for 2 years, how she'd finally started to understand the magnitude of what she'd done. She didn't make excuses or try to explain away her actions, just acknowledge the pain she'd caused and the lives she'd damaged. She wrote about coming to terms with her infertility and learning healthier ways to process grief. She said she understood if I never forgave her and didn't expect a response. I sat with the letter for 3 days before deciding to write back. My response was brief, and I didn't offer forgiveness because I wasn't there yet, and might never be. But I acknowledged that she seemed to be doing real work to change, and I told her that was important even if it didn't undo the harm. My therapist said writing back was a healthy step in my own healing process, that acknowledging Rachel's growth didn't mean excusing what she'd done. Tom had been visiting every few months since our son was born, and his relationship with our kids were something I treasured. He'd video call every Sunday evening, and our daughter would tell him about preschool while our son babbled at the screen. Tom always remembered their favorite snacks and brought thoughtful gifts when he visited. Nothing expensive, but things that showed he paid attention to what they liked. Our daughter knew him as Uncle Tom and asked when he was coming to visit the same way she asked about my parents. Our son was learning his name, pointing at the phone and saying something that sounded like Tom when the video calls started. I'd never told the kids that Tom was married to the woman who tried to steal our daughter because that was too complicated for them to understand and might make them afraid of him. As far as they knew, Uncle Tom was just our family member who lived far away, but loved them very much. Mark and I had worked hard to separate Tom from Rachel's actions and preserve the family connection because Tom had been a victim too. He'd lost his wife and his marriage and spent years dealing with guilt over not seeing the warning signs. Watching him play with our kids during his visits made me proud that we'd managed to salvage something good from the wreckage Rachel had created. 5 years after the kidnapping, I got an email inviting me to speak at a national conference on the hospital security and patient safety. The organizer had read Detective Haley's book and wanted me to share our story with healthcare administrators from across the country. I almost deleted the email because the thought of standing in front of hundreds of people and reliving the worst days of my life made me feel sick. But Mark encouraged me to consider it, and my therapist thought it could be empowering. I spent 3 weeks preparing my presentation, working with the conference organizers to focus on specific security failures and systemic changes, rather than just the emotional trauma. The day of the conference, I stood on stage looking out at an auditorium full of hospital administrators and told them exactly how Rachel had exploited their security gaps. I explained the falsified records, the corrupted footage, the ease with which she'd accessed systems that should have been secure. I showed them the timeline of how quickly everything fell apart once Rachel set her plan in motion. After my presentation, dozens of administrators approached me with questions about their own protocols, and several hospitals reached out in the following weeks, asking me to consult on their security systems. Turning our trauma into meaningful systemic change felt like taking back power Rachel had tried to steal from us. Our daughter was 5 years old when she came home from kindergarten and asked why she didn't have an Aunt Rachel like her friend Sophie had an aunt who took her to the zoo. Mark and I had been preparing for this conversation for years, knowing eventually she'd notice the gap in our family structure. We sat down with her that evening and told her an age-appropriate version of the truth. We explained that Aunt Rachel had been very sick in her mind and had made bad choices that hurt our family. We told her that Aunt Rachel was getting help now in a special place and that we were all safe and happy together. Our daughter processed this information the way 5-year-olds do, asking a few clarifying questions about what kind of sick and whether Aunt Rachel would get better. We answered honestly but simply, saying we didn't know if Aunt Rachel would get completely better, but that she was trying. Our daughter seemed satisfied with this explanation and went back to playing with her toys. She mentioned it once more a few days later, asking if Aunt Rachel was still sick, and when I said yes, she just nodded and moved on to asking what was for dinner. Looking at our family now, I could see how completely Rachel had failed in every way that mattered. She'd tried to steal our daughter and destroy our family, but instead we were stronger and closer than we might have been without the trauma. Our daughter was thriving in kindergarten, our son was learning to walk, and Mark and I had a marriage that had survived an unimaginable crisis. We had a network of support that included Frederick and Detective Haley and Tom, people who'd helped us rebuild and stayed in our lives. Every ordinary moment felt precious because we knew how easily it could have been taken from us. Weekend mornings when both kids climbed into our bed, family dinners where our daughter told elaborate stories about her day, bath time when our son splashed water everywhere and laughed. These simple moments were our victory over Rachel's attempt to destroy us. We'd built a beautiful life despite her worst efforts, and that felt like the best revenge and the truest justice we could have hoped for. Our daughter would grow up knowing she was loved and safe, and our son would never know a time when our family wasn't whole. Rachel was in prison dealing with the consequences of her choices, while we were home living the life she'd tried to steal, and that was exactly how it should be.